During the last decade and a half, the game developer From Software has made a name for itself with its recent string of high fantasy video games characterized by their difficulty as well as the visual spectacle they bring as they let you battle with a diverse group of foes, from knights in regal armor to dragons to hideous monsters, and even a few gods. These games have spawned their own subgenre known as Souls-like games. The name is derived from their first few games, Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, which both have a fantasy setting with intense hand-to-hand combat, as well as spellcasting and exploration. Now, with this high fantasy setting comes a challenge. How do you localize this for a given locale? In this video, I will explore some of the process and challenges that went into localizing the various games in From Software's catalog, both from Japanese into English, as well as into other secondary languages. The primary challenge in the initial localization effort came with the translation of director Hidetaka Miyazaki's ideas from his native Japanese into English. This was most important because these games are modeled after the Western fantasy literature movement. The characters all have a European appearance, and the dialogue is exclusively in English in most of From Software's Souls-like games. So, it was important that the dialogue was properly represented in an English style so as to capture the Western fantasy influence in the games. This involves using Old English terminology, such as using the pronouns thee and thou, as well as certain archaic forms of verbs.
Well met. 'Tis good to see ye in good health. What needs smithing this day?
In addition to this grammar, there was a challenge to translate the names of the various characters as well as items and weapons into English while maintaining the tone of a Western fantasy setting. The director of translation for the Dark Souls series, as well as several of their other games, was Ryan Morris, the lead translator at Frog Nation, which is a Tokyo and London-based translating consultancy. Morris and Miyazaki had many conversations throughout the development of each game about how to render the Japanese names and dialogue into English in a way that would match the expectations of a Western fantasy audience. Sometimes this was a challenge for them, as new words had to be invented for an item, or other times an old word had to be given a new meaning, such as the way the games use the word humanity, hallowed, ashen, and the eponymous souls. For some translations of the games, they faced an interesting challenge. The nomenclature of an English Western fantasy setting is familiar to the minds of English speakers. However, for those of other languages, such as Spanish and Arabic, it can be a challenge to evoke the same tone. So translators for many of these languages had to make an extra effort to think about the word choice, as well as to avoid using words or names with strong connotations that could distract from the immersion of the game. As mentioned previously, one of From Software's recent games, titled Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, is different from the rest as it is not based off the Western fantasy setting like the other Souls-like games. Instead, this game is set in the historical Sengoku-era Japan in the late 1500s. So, for this game, a different method had to be chosen for localization, one that ultimately resulted in having multiple languages of spoken dialogue available. However, when you first start the game, it prompts you to leave the dialogue in Japanese and instead read subtitles in your language, with the intent to preserve the intended experience of the game.
赤炉抜けぬとは
奥の院の巫女が言うには不思議りは抜いた者に死をもたらす刀.
This aligns much more with the foreignization method of localization. Almost all names are rendered in their original Japanese, spelled phonetically in English or other languages, with the exception of certain titles and nicknames of characters which are relevant to the plot and need to be translated. The game even uses a kanji character to represent an unblockable enemy attack in combat, and this character is used no matter what translation of the game is being used. This focus on foreignization is meant to bring the player to the game, rather than bringing the game to the player, helping to heighten the tone of the Japanese setting for non-Japanese players around the world. The difference in localization styles between Sekiro and From Software's other recent games demonstrates that there's more than one way one can go about localizing and still have success. The method you choose depends upon your audience, the property that you are translating, and the experience you want the audience to have. Do you want to highlight a particular cultural or historic setting? Or do you want to evoke the audience's imagination? Whichever you choose, it may be good to look towards From Software's recent games as inspiration for how to have a successful localization that impacts audiences all across the world.